Hello, I'm Sonny.
And I'm Joseph.
We're coming to you from National Chenchi University in Taipei, Taiwan.
In the 1980s, the Republic of China, referred to as Taiwan, experienced an economic miracle as a result of President Chen Hsiao-cheng's $4.7 billion 10 major construction projects effort. As a result, Taiwan emerged alongside Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea as one of the 4 Asian tigers and currently exhibits a flourishing democracy. Since recovering from the global financial crisis, Taiwan's economy has slowly but steadily continued to grow. However, Taiwan's continued economic growth is threatened by effects of globalization, specifically through the increase of bilateral FTAs, bilateral investment treaties, and the current development of mega FTAs. In 2010, mainland China and Taiwan signed the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which eliminated tariffs on 539 Taiwanese exports to the mainland, valued at $13.8 billion. Despite the fact that it has also signed bilateral FTAs with New Zealand and Singapore, it has not yet been able to negotiate FTAs with any other non-Chinese major trading partners. Unlike its main trade competitor, South Korea, Taiwan faces complex diplomatic challenges that hinder its abilities to successfully establish bilateral FTAs and participate in the development of mega FTAs.
This difficulty has led to fears that such a reliance on trade with mainland China will subject the island to an unacceptable degree of influence from the mainland,
ultimately threatening its sovereignty. As a result, Taiwan has currently indicated an interest in joining the US-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 12-nation mega FTA that includes 40% of the global GDP, which promotes high standards on a range of trade issues from intellectual property rights to foreign direct investment protections. While on the surface, TPP will provide greater economic prosperity for its members, what are the second and third order effects towards Taiwan? Today we're going to explore the implications of 2 scenarios. First, considering the implications of Taiwan's accession to the TPP, and second, the effects of it not joining the TPP. Surprisingly, in both scenarios, we predict that cross-strait relations will deteriorate because of the diplomatic status quo cannot be maintained. Increased cross-strait tensions will create greater regional instability, causing the U.S. to accelerate its Asia rebalancing strategy. Before considering the multi-level effects of TPP to regional security, it is important to understand the direct impact it will have on Taiwan. The most obvious impact to Taiwan joining the TPP is that it would ensure diversity in its export destinations, allowing it to reduce its economic dependence on mainland China. Data from 2012 indicates that Taiwan's current trade with the TPP members accounts for 32% of its exports, and this share will only grow as these nations are able to realize the benefits of free trade. If South Korea and the Philippines are also admitted to TPP, 7 of Taiwan's top 10 exporting destinations would be member states, completely offsetting Taiwan's cross-strait exports. Although Taiwan is currently seeking TPP membership, it faces several domestic challenges that could prevent it from gaining acceptance by current members. To gain admission, Taiwan must first conduct bilateral talks with current member states and gain their support. Much like the US, Taiwan's special interest groups significantly influence the policymaking process. For instance, Taiwan is likely to encounter resistance from the US until it is willing to lift its restrictions on US beef and pork imports. However, its domestic agricultural industry, despite accounting for less than 2% of Taiwan's GDP, will strongly resist opening Taiwan's meat markets to the US. Additionally, in order to meet TPP's high standards, Taiwan must implement significant policy reforms, especially in its banking and investment regulations, as well as its commitment to enforcing intellectual property rights. But in a polarized democracy, sweeping reforms must endure intense scrutiny and face substantial challenges in reaching a bipartisan consensus. The risk of Taiwan not joining TPP are also very high. Taiwan's small and medium enterprises manufacture critical components to the Asian supply chains. In fact, SMEs contribute more than 80% of Taiwan's GDP. Thus, Taiwan's economic prosperity relies on their continued productivity and growth. However, proposed rules of origin under TPP will dictate that member nations must favor each other's supply chain products above non-members. For example, the yarn forward rule requires that when making apparel, any materials from the yarn stage forward must be sourced from a TPP member nation. Otherwise, normal tariffs will apply. As a result, Taiwan's 3,200 textile manufacturers that employ 145,000 people would lose over $2.7 billion of exports to Vietnam and the US.
In addition to the textile and apparel sectors, Taiwan's chemical, Plastic and rubber industry will all suffer if Taiwan is unable to accede to TPP. While the direct impacts of TPP to Taiwan are clear, the following effects require a broader understanding of Asian-Pacific international political economy.
Since 1979, the U.S. has effectively managed cross-strait relations through the implementation of policies that help maintain the status quo relationship of Taiwan. The U.S. does not recognize Taiwan's sovereignty, but also does not recognize mainland China's claim to Taiwan. Because several other Asian nations have signed bilateral FTAs, in order to stay competitive in the global market, Taiwan must do the same. However, engaging in FTA negotiations is particularly problematic for Taiwan, because the mere fact that Taipei engages in talks with foreign nations implies that it has the sovereign authority to do so. This directly violates Beijing's interpretation of One China outlined in the 1992 Consensus. Therefore, Taiwan's accession to the TPP is a politically significant leap that gives Taiwan credibility to participate in international agreements, which is likely to foster greater international support for its participation in future international negotiations and organizations. By gaining admission to the TPP, 12 nations, none of which currently recognize Taiwan's sovereignty, would indirectly acknowledge Taiwan's interpretation of One China. Clearly, Beijing would reject Taipei's political distancing and cross-strait tensions will intensify. In fact, despite the warming of cross-strait relations during Taiwan's Ma administration, there are several recent indicators that illustrate Beijing's concern over Taiwan's political ambitions. For instance, in March, mainland China's President Xi Jinping asserted that, quote, China and the mainland are indivisible components, unquote. And just 2 weeks ago, Beijing rejected Taipei's application as a founding member to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Beijing has also signaled its seriousness in using military force to keep Taipei in check. Since 2008, the mainland has stationed over 500 fighter aircraft within striking distance of Taiwan and has over 1,500 missiles pointing at the island.
Domestic factors also have great potential to exacerbate the tensions, especially if Taiwan's opposition, Democratic Progressive Party (DPP), wins the 2016 presidential election and mainland China's economic growth continues to slow.
If Taiwan is unable to join the TPP, the long-term impacts to its economy could be devastating, especially if its neighboring competitors are able to accede. As a result, the cross-strait status quo changes because Taiwan's greater reliance on access to Chinese markets makes it more vulnerable to Chinese political pressure, ultimately weakening Taiwan's sovereignty. Greater Chinese influence over Taiwan's affairs would stimulate intense domestic resistance, as demonstrated by last spring's Sunflower Movement protests, where students occupied the Legislative Yuan for over 24 days in response to President Ma's controversial trade agreement with mainland China. And we can comfortably predict that an overwhelming majority of Taiwan's 23 million people will resist
any steps mainland China may take towards reunification, as fewer than 12% of Taiwanese are supportive of reunification. Domestic resistance to China's pressure will strain cross-strait relations. In fact, because the KMT's poor performance in the 2014 mayoral elections, President Ma's abysmal approval ratings, and the concerns of 2016 DPP presidential win, both Beijing and Washington are carefully watching Taiwan's political developments.
Because cross-strait relations will intensify in either case, the U.S. is likely to respond by accelerating its Asian rebalance and therefore potentially strain Sino-U.S. relations, further destabilizing Northeast Asia. Although our predictions so far may seem alarmist, there are a few options that Beijing, Taipei, and Washington could consider to help preserve the status quo and alleviate political tensions. First, since Beijing has also demonstrated an interest in joining the TPP, Washington and other TPP members could simultaneously admit China and Taiwan, allowing Taiwan's participation under its often used name Chinese Taipei to quell Chinese political sensitivities. While this seems to be the optimal win-win-win situation that could prevent escalations and cross-strait tensions, in reality, both Beijing and Taipei must implement serious domestic reforms in order to comply with the high standards set by the TPP. Moreover, including China in the TPP will prevent the division of Asian supply chain, promoting greater regional economic stability. On the other hand, China could also welcome Taiwan into RCEP, the Chinese-led mega FTA. Although Taiwan would still be heavily dependent on Chinese market access, it would still allow it to diversify with free trade to 15 other nations, 4 of which are currently engaged in TPP negotiations. This effort, along with allowing Taiwan's accession to the AIIB as an economic entity, may realize Beijing's strategy to win the hearts and minds of Taiwanese. In conclusion, the issue of Taiwan's sovereignty will continue to play a critical role in cross-strait relations, Sino-US relations, and the overall East Asian regional stability. Although globalization is forcing potentially destabilizing change, it is also creating greater economic interdependence. As a result, now more than ever, everyone has more to lose. We can only hope that global leaders will exercise judicious diplomacy that will lead to mutually beneficial, peaceful, and prosperous solutions for the 21st century and beyond.